Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be discussing two aspects of the foreign policy establishment in the United States. We're going to be in the first segment, we're going to be talking about the bureaucracy. I think the way you can think about this is that these are the tools and these are the individuals that actually implement foreign policy whenever Congress or the president decides to do anything. Of course, neither Congress nor the president actually implements the foreign policy, right? They allocate the money, they make the decisions, but the task of actually implementing what the United States wants to do, be it military, be it information, be it diplomacy, that falls to the bureaucrats. And these bureaucrats, for the most part, tend to be career officials. The top of every bureaucracy is replaced with a political appointee as administrations change. But for the most part, these individuals stay in these jobs, right? So the people that actually, on a day-to-day basis, do the tasks associated with American foreign policy, they tend to be there for extended periods. They're career officials. They've been derisively called the deep state. They've been called individuals that are plotting, that have their own agenda, etc. So we want to evaluate that claim today as to if there is a deep state, how would it work, how effective it is. Just to give you a preview, I don't happen to believe that there is this idea of a deep state. Most of these individuals, again, tend to be focused on their task. They tend to be interested in their tasks. They might really advocate for their task. So, for example, if it's an individual that's at the DEA, they might think that narco traffic is a single biggest threat to the United States, and they might advocate and push that position. But it doesn't seem to be the case that many of these individuals are coordinated enough or informed enough or know everything about other bureaucracies to actually exercise what you might call a deep state conspiracy. Collectively, these individuals form what Peter Fever and others in the article you're going to read today are called the foreign policy blob, right? That they're individuals that are well informed, that are following foreign policy on a day-to-day basis. They focus on this. And so this cadre of individuals has developed a sense of expertise over events in the world. And what's interesting is that while they're well informed about the world, sometimes they're wrong, right? Sometimes they make mistakes. I mentioned to you the other day that when it came to the Iraq War, I like to think of myself as well informed, and I was well informed in 2003. But much of what I thought about Saddam's behavior turned out to be wrong. Some things I got right, other things I got wrong. And that happens, right? It can be the case that individuals like Sean Penn, as I mentioned, who was an actor that traveled to Baghdad and declared that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction. Occasionally, that individual is going to be right, and someone that devotes their entire life to studying something is going to be wrong. That happens. But again, the key thing to remember is that if you focus on the individual that is specialized in this for a long period of time versus the uninformed actor, if you look at a series of 100 or 1,000 decisions, what you can expect is that the individual that is better informed, that's specialized in this area, is going to be right more of the time. Maybe not in just every one instance, but more of the time. So I think that's where if you think about it that way, there's a real value in having these career officials populate the government. What you don't want is every time a government changes, every time there's a change of presidency, that people have to learn all the intricacies of Mali again, for example, or have to learn all the intricacies of Nigeria again, or Saudi Arabia. You want these individuals to be there to have some continuity so that that expertise stays within each of these agencies. So that would be my my pitch to you as to why these individuals are actually quite valuable. But we want to dig into the bureaucracy, and sort of what I'll do is I'll give you an idea of how the U.S. foreign policy establishment is designed, and how there was an evolution and how the armed forces were designed in the post World War II era. There was original design. It then changed in the 1980s with Cold War Nichols. So we want to talk about how the U.S. military is structured today. So that's the overview of the first part. The second part, we're going to talk about crisis decision making, and we're going to talk about how the presidency is the key part of crisis decision making. So that will be the second part of today's lecture. I do want to remind you, it seems really strange because it seems like you just started, but Monday is your first exam. The exam will only cover the parts of the course that have to do with the U.S. foreign policy establishment. It'll be 20 multiple choice questions. You'll just answer them. And then after that, there are two parts. One will begin our second block of instruction, which has to do with interstate conflict. We'll have a lecture on looking at why is it that we believe that humans fight each other, and then we'll also have a data demonstration looking at the correlates of war data, which to some extent still are, and for sure were, the key way in which international politics was studied using science, using systematic study. So we will move into that as we head into Monday. And then next week, we'll be talking almost exclusively about interstate wars and how this period of U.S. dominance evolved from World War II. Okay, so let's get into our discussion of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. I will pull up those slides. Do a share screen. This usually takes my computer a little bit, so bear with me. Okay, so what we want to understand again today is that whenever a policy is enacted, whenever a president decides to do something, or whenever Congress decides to do something, how do they actually implement policies? So Congress might decide, for example, to sanction Iran, right? Or the president might decide that they want to sanction Iran. Now, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to do that. How do they do that? Well, today's sanctions are typically done by working through the Treasury Department. So it's these bureaucracies that are actually responsible for implementing policy. Because these bureaucracies, again, are individuals or tend to be populated by individuals that are career bureaucrats that stay there. So, for example, the director of the FBI doesn't change with every administration, and every FBI official doesn't change with every administration. Because that's true, right? There's a belief, I think, that's been growing in the United States that these individuals constitute what you might call a deep state, right? That they're there forever, they have their own agenda. Again, the reason why I'd be skeptical of that is that this would have to assume that a very large group of people shares a coherent agenda and is working in coordination to that. Just as a really simple example as to why I think that might not be true, try to coordinate with your friends. Right? That sounds silly, but try to coordinate with a large group of people as to where you may want to go, what you might want to do, what your plans are for the summer, etc. And what you'll quickly find is that you'll start to see competition in ideas. You'll start to see competition in what people want to do. You'll start to see competition in how people think that they can implement that. You'll start to see competition in how people think that they can do a better job than the other one. That happens on small teams, right? If you ever play sports, that happens in small teams at work, if you ever do that. And if you then magnify that by several different bureaucracies, what you'll see is that it's very hard to get that sort of coordinated action necessary to create something called the deep state, especially with an organization as complex as the United States government. So you can keep that idea in mind, but again, I think, and I don't want to tell you exactly what to think, but I'll tell you based on empirical evidence. It would be very difficult for me to accept something like that there is this entity just called the deep state that's capable of that level of coordination. So having said that, let's take a look at what this would look like. So pre-1947, this is the flowchart that captures the U.S. foreign policy establishment. What you can see is that even pre-1947, foreign policy was led by the presidency. The president had the top spot when it came to implementing foreign policy. That's part of the Constitution. The Constitution gave war powers to Congress, but in terms of implementing the war, in terms of executing the war, that task went to the executive branch. Underneath the president's tools for implementing policy included the Department of State, which handled diplomacy, It included the Department of War, which consisted of the Army, and it had the Department of the Navy. So if the president chose to implement any foreign policy, the president had a cadre of diplomats in the State Department. It had an Army, right, with the Department of War, and it had a Navy at its disposal, right? So that's what the president had. In 1947, we saw the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, which made this structure much more complex, right? So it introduced several new bureaucracies, which gave the president new capabilities in implementing his or her agenda and implementing what Congress wanted to do as well. So we saw the creation of what was called the Department of Defense. This is a modern organization that supplanted the Department of War in the U.S. security structure. It also put together several of the branches into one organization, right? So you didn't necessarily have a Department of the Navy. It was put together with the Department of Defense. You also, underneath the Department of Defense, saw the creation of the U.S. Air Force. Prior to this act, the Air Force was part of the Army, right? Now the Air Force has its own separate branch. More recently, the United States created what was called the Space Force, which was once housed under the U.S. Air Force. But in 1947, we saw the major creation of the U.S. Air Force. You also saw the creation of an entity called the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was represented by each branch of the U.S. military that had some central coordination over what the U.S. military was doing. So you had a head officer that would be there to advise the president and advise the president on their organization's capability. You also had the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Prior to 1947, this was under an organization called the Organization for Strategic Services, the OSS. CIA was created in 1947 in response to a growing myriad of threats that the United States believed it was facing. A key part of the CIA is that it is a civilian organization. It was something that was intended to provide a civilian perspective on modern intelligence, as opposed to just getting intelligence from all the branches of the military. Each branch of the military has their own intelligence organization. The CIA is intended to be a civilian intelligence organization. We also saw the creation of the National Security Council. The National Security Council is a group of individuals that is responsible for informing the president on key strategy issues associated with foreign policy. They are a key part, they're a group of key principal players. They're supposed to discuss and come up with consensus on what foreign policy threats exist and what foreign policy action can be taken. So the way the U.S. government is structured is that now, if we look at this as a standard organizational structure, the president sits over a group of bureaucracies that are headed by different secretaries. So the president sits over the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, etc., amongst other bureaucracies that are at their disposal. Underneath the secretaries, there is typically a deputy secretary, an undersecretary of something else, and then we have assistant secretaries. So underneath those, we see that there are different appointees. So the secretaries that are appointed change with the president. There can be some continuity. In some cases, secretaries may be kept over. So for example, the Secretary of Defense was kept from the second Bush administration to the Obama administration. Bob Gates remained Secretary of Defense. This was done largely to maintain some continuity in U.S. defense. And he was someone that seemed to work well with the Obama administration. Obama seemed to like him. But that's not typically done. Typically, secretaries change with the president. Underneath the secretaries, the bureaucracies tend to remain the same. There can be changes, there can be resignations, there can be movement, but typically career bureaucrats under these secretaries and undersecretaries remain the same within these bureaucracies. So this is one large bureaucracy in the United States. It's the old bureaucracy of the Department of State. Again, you can take a look at this. We see that there is I don't want to go over each of these different offices, but what you can see is that these outline the career bureaucrats. Underneath the political appointees, the Secretary of States, etc., you can see that there are some organizations that tend to maintain some continuity. So for example, African affairs wouldn't change a whole lot once you see a transition from one president to another. The point of this is at the top, there's political appointees. Underneath, there are career bureaucrats that stay in these positions for a long period of time. The reason, again, that that's useful is that those career bureaucrats tend to have quite a bit of information. You can see that they tend to be quite specialized in what they're doing. So, for example, if we look at one particular agency, it's just budget and planning. You probably wouldn't want turnover in that agency all the time. You'd probably want somebody that understands budget and planning, that can maintain some continuity. That's useful in terms of maintaining this organization's continuity and doing the day-to-day operations, right? So that's essential. And that's true even in other bureaucracies like UNC. So I recently became chair of PWAD. When I did, again, Luke Morgan remained on board after there was a transition from Wayne Lee to me. That was useful in maintaining the continuity of operations because Luke knows what he's doing. So again, in this case, you would also have individuals like that stay on board even though there's change at the top. Again, there's a key difference here between the career versus appointees, right? Which creates this, and may create a bit of a dilemma, right? So when the Obama administration left, many of the career bureaucrats that served the Obama administration stayed the same. And then when the Trump administration came into office, there was some concern that some of those individuals in the career bureaucracy who continued to fulfill the agenda of the Obama administration versus fulfill the agenda of the Trump administration. So that created this idea that the career bureaucrats have their own agenda and are part of what you might call a deep state. Again, that assumes that there is complete divergence between the Obama administration's agenda and the Trump administration's agenda. I don't think that that's always the case, right? They're certainly very different individuals. They certainly have very different politics. But in terms of the day-to-day operations, right, to make sure, for example, that diplomats are paid or to make sure that diplomats in foreign missions are protected, those are functions that basically remain the same from administration to administration, and that's where the career bureaucrats typically come in. So you could look at them as a deep state, right? They don't change; they continue to continue their day-to-day operations, or you could look at it perhaps in a less or in a more benign way, where these career bureaucrats are just doing a job that would remain the same regardless of who's in charge at the political level. It's true that whoever is at charge at the political level will set the agenda, but some day-to-day functions basically need to continue. And so, for example, China continues to need to be monitored regardless of who's in charge. Argentina needs to be continued to monitor regardless of who's in charge, and that's where the career diplomats would do their job, regardless of who's actually in charge, regardless of who actually is the political appointee. The career bureaucrats remain there. Okay, so if we move on and we look at another large bureaucracy within the U.S. defense establishment, right? This is the Department of Defense. Again, it was reorganized, and you see within the Department of Defense, this is where the military is housed, right? So in the Department of Defense, you see that there is a Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense sits over the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Undersecretaries of Defense, etc. It also sits over the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, the Department of the Air Force. The Marine Corps is underneath the Department of the Navy, right? So the Department of the Navy is supervising both the Navy and the Marine Corps. The Department of the Army handles the Army, and the Department of the Air Force handles the Air Force. As a co-equal, right, we see that there is a Joint Chiefs of Staff headed by a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And this is linked to this thing called the Joint Staff. The Joint Chiefs are responsible for informing the president in terms of foreign policy activity about what their agency can do. But a key part of it is that the Joint Chiefs don't actually implement military activity, right? Oftentimes they're thought of as implementing military activity, but they are advisory, right? They are supposed to provide information to the president about their organization's capability and to think about strategic issues associated with their organization. When it comes time to implementing any sort of military policy, that falls to what's called the combatant commands. And you can see that there are 9 combatant commands within the United States. There's the Africa Command, which is AFRICOM. There's CENTCOM, which is Central Command, which is responsible for the Middle East. There's also the European Command, the Northern Command, the Pacific Command, the Southern Command, which is Latin America, Special Operations Command, the Strategic Command, and the Transportation Command. Those are the entities that typically implement military policy, and they were created to try to coordinate the military branches a bit more. Those combatant commands are diverse in terms of what's under them. They have capabilities from all of these different agencies that are at their disposal. So that's a way of trying to coordinate these assets the president has. The president has assets in terms of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. These combatants commands integrate these assets so the president has something that can be useful when it comes time to implementing policy. What we can also see is that under the Office of the Secretary of Defense, you can see that there are defense agencies like DARPA, which provides military grants, and there's other activities here like the defense media activity, etc. Right? These are all career bureaucrats that stay regardless of who's at the top. So to look at the Office of the Secretary of Defense a bit further, you can see more of what they're doing. Right? You can see that some of what they're doing is associated with intelligence, some of what they're doing is associated with global affairs analysis, and some of it's just pretty mundane things, right? The Inspector General, the General Counsel, legislative affairs, etc. Right? A lot of what's done in these bureaucracies, again, this is something that's not typically thought of as really mundane things, right? Really simple day-to-day things. It's really interesting to me that many students in P1 have wanted to work in these bureaucracies. That's a fine job. I wouldn't discourage you from that. But a lot of it's pretty simple day-to-day stuff. When a lot of students get into the intelligence community, they think, oh, this is going to be really exciting. And when they first get in, it's not really, right? A lot of it's budget procurements, et cetera, right? If it's pretty, watching media sources, it's pretty mundane, right? It's pretty routine stuff. So let's take a look at what these combatant commands entail. Again, the combatant commands are here. These are the 9 entities that are responsible for implementing military policy. Again, you can see that they are based on 2 functions. They're based on 2 divisions. The first is they have a geographic division. You can see that there are several different geographic areas where the combatant commands operate, and they're also based on function, right? So we have the cyber command, the special operations command, the strategic command, and the transportation command, right? These are assets. These are commands that allow the president to actually implement their policy. So if we think about what these commands are doing, each command is responsible for a part of the globe. To me, this is really fascinating because most countries don't have anything like this. And I want to say that again. Most countries don't have anything like these capabilities. Take a look at this map. What this is telling you is that the United States is capable of using one of its commands to influence events anywhere in the world. Most countries don't exercise any military power beyond their own borders. And even within their own borders, it's skeptical, right? How much they can actually control. And most militaries of the world are not designed to project power outside of the territory of the state. Most of them are designed towards fighting internal rebellions. But if you look at the United States military, it has a global reach, which is why the United States is truly a superpower compared to many other countries in the world. Again, to emphasize, most countries do not have this capability. Most countries can't just say, well, if there's an activity happening in Latin America, call SOCOM, or if there's something happening in the Pacific, call PACOM, or try to coordinate the 2 of them. That just doesn't happen, right? The US has that capability, which is the superpower capability. The actual place where the superpower capability is exercised are through these combatant commands. If the United States wants to do something in the Middle East, it calls CENTCOM. If the United States wants to respond to Russia, it calls EUCOM, right? EUCOM, right? If the United States wants to influence events in Africa, AFRICOM. If it wants to influence events in the Pacific, it's now dealing with something called Indo-PACOM, which is responsible for both the Indian area, the subcontinent area, and the Pacific theater. Okay, so this was part of a reorganization that happened as part of a bill that was known as Goldwater-Nichols, right? This happened in 1986. What this did was to try to create some organization, right? So the modern structure of the National Security Council of the Secretary of Defense and the creation of these combatant commands came after 1986. This was largely a response to some of the issues that the United States had during the Vietnam War, but also during an operation in Grenada in the early 1980s. The United States decided to invade Grenada in the early 1980s. That seemed like it should be something that the United States should have been able to do and should have been able to do very effectively. It was able to invade Grenada, it was able to do it effectively, but what was identified was that there were severe coordination issues between these different branches of the US military. So what Goldwater-Nichols was intended to do was to try to put the different assets of the US military under these combatant commands to make it easier for the president to be able to use the full capability of the United States. So just for example, what was really important was for the Navy to be coordinating with the Air Force, right? If they're under different branches, they're going to want different things, they're going to advocate for different things, and they're not going to necessarily work and play well with each other. They're not going to integrate their capabilities. It was also important for the Navy to coordinate with the Army. Again, if they were housed in different branches, it was going to be much more difficult to have a seamless use of these capabilities together. By unifying them under these combatant commands, it was intended to make these assets more integrated, more coordinated, more synchronatic, more working together, rather than have different branches competing with each other. So there was a couple of different changes as part of Goldwater-Nichols in 1986. First, what Goldwater-Nichols did was enhance the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? This created a position where there was, for 2 years, for additional terms, there was rotation from branches, so the Joint Chiefs chair would not remain from the same branch over and over and over again. What the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is a principal military advisor. Say that again, they're a principal military advisor to the president, but they do not control anything, right? They don't command any armed forces directly. They are there to try to advise, they are there to try to represent the military's, in essence, what the military can do, and to put the military at the table when these decisions are being made. But that's, in a sense, an appointment that's intended to be an advisory role to the president. So that is not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They're often thought of as the commander of the entire military, sort of, right? What they're doing is advising the president, but when the president wants to implement anything, so if the president wants to make war in the Middle East, it's the commander of CENTCOM that does that. CENTCOM does that. The Joint Chiefs of Staff guy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is part of the decision making that leads to the president making the choice. But CENTCOM is the one that's going to implement that. And the CENTCOM combatant commander answers directly to the Secretary of Defense. So it's not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff intervening in this process. The Secretary of Defense then informs the commander of CENTCOM that they want to make war in the Middle East, and that's how the process is done. So what Goldwater-Nichols also does is increase inter-service command, right? The chairs are supposed to train and equip, right? The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are responsible for training their forces and equipping their forces. But the combatant commands, the COCOMs, have operational command over warfighting. So the chairman since the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Chiefs are responsible for providing the funds to their organization, they're responsible for the training of their organization. But when it comes time to use these assets to make sure that they're integrated, to make sure that they coordinate themselves, the task of war fighting is left to the COCOM. So if there is war in the Middle East, the combatant commander, CENTCOM, would have operational control over the war fighting. What this also does is allow for shared procurement of resources, right? So you don't have the Army and the Navy and the Air Force competing to try to get different resources from American society. This allows for some shared procurement where they can work together so they're not competing for scarce resources. So that's the combatant commanders. Let's also take a look at the intelligence community. This is the IC. I would imagine that many of you are interested in eventually trying to obtain employment in the IC. That's certainly something many P1 majors want to do. So let's take a look at what the IC actually looks like. There's an office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is intended to coordinate many of the activities of the IC. But you can see that the IC is also broken into different branches, right? So you have the CIA, you have the DIA, the FBI also has its own national security branch. You can also see there's the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, and the NSA, which is the National Security Agency. Interestingly enough, many states, like New York, for example, have their own intelligence agencies that collect information on foreign policy and on threats. So you can also see there's the DEA, which is an intelligence organization, the Energy Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, DHS, the State Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and Treasury. Treasury is a very key important part of the intelligence establishment. And then the different service branches also have their own intelligence. So there's Air Force intelligence, Army intelligence. The Coast Guard has their own intelligence agency. So does the Marine Corps, and so does the Navy. So each of the military branches have their own intelligence community, their own intelligence organizations as well. Each of these agencies is collecting information about the world and about threats and about potential threats in the world. You might argue that this creates some situations where one hand of the U.S. intelligence community doesn't talk to the other one. It can, right? Certainly that can be the case. But what this also does is allow for checks. If the CIA misses something, the DIA is there. And if the DIA misses something, the NSA is there. What we also see is that they're doing different things, right? The NSA, for example, is focusing pretty exclusively on communications and electronic communications, whereas the CIA also houses in the civilian branch much more of the human assets that the U.S. has to inform itself about the world. Now, when we look at how these assets are used, right, how does this work? These assets perform day-to-day functions, right? And for the most part, their day-to-day functions are not that interesting, right? I doubt many of you got into this course trying to understand what does the State Department do to make sure that tourists who lose their passports are able to get their passports, right? Some of you may well be interested in that. It's perfectly interesting to me. It's a reasonable thing, and actually it constitutes most of the foreign policy that's actually done, right? A lot of the foreign policy is also being done is how do particular commodities that come to the United States meet U.S. laws and U.S. standards? How do you check for that? Perfectly reasonable thing to do, really important function, but it is, not to be derisive, but it is a bit more mundane, right? And since those are the tasks that are done more often in foreign policy, they're done on a daily basis in foreign policy, that's what most of these career bureaucrats are doing, right? It's pretty simple stuff, right? And it's not simple in the sense that it's easy, but it's stuff that tends to be done on a day-to-day basis that we don't think about. When most of you think about foreign policy, and certainly when I did, when I was an undergraduate student, what I was more interested in are crises. Right? What happens when there's a disruption to the daily day-to-day events, right? That's really what most students tend to be interested in, right? Again, now to remember, most decisions are non-crises, right? Contracting is not crisis. How to set up state visits, that's really important, but it's not crisis. How to deal with passports and international issues, all important stuff, but not crisis behavior, right? Crises, on the other hand, involve disruptions of normal events. These are interesting because the bureaucracies are set up to do certain things. What happens when what they're normally dealing with changes? For example, there's a large part of the IC that's devoted towards studying Russia, right? What happens when there is a crisis in Russia, when something that was not expected changes, right? What happens when Russia starts to move outside of its sphere and starts to escalating its presence in the North Pole, right? How does the bureaucracy deal with that? It didn't expect that necessarily. It had some expectation of that behavior, but it has to deal with something that changes the routine day to day. So a crisis is a disruption of the normal relations between a pair of states. So the Cuban Missile Crisis is an example of a crisis, right? All these bureaucracies that are there are now going to be necessary. Those are now the assets that the executive has to respond to this crisis. When there is that crisis, when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, right, the Kennedy administration had to decide what to do, right? It had to decide how to respond to this disruption of normal relationships between itself and the Soviet Union. The way it could respond was to use the assets that it had in place, which were the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, and other assets, and as in the intelligence community, et cetera. Those were what the government had to actually respond to this. This is what bureaucracies do, right? They're set up to do these things. They're set up to, in a sense, respond to crises. They're set up to do the mundane. But regardless of what happens, regardless of what's unexpected in the world, these are the agencies that are there that have to respond to these crises. 9/11 is another example of that. When 9/11 happened, the U.S. had to figure out, okay, how does it respond to the immediate situation in New York? How does it then try to coordinate a response that the Bush administration wanted? The Bush administration wanted to make war in Afghanistan. That fell to CENTCOM, right? That would fall to the Combat Command of CENTCOM. But CENTCOM didn't have a whole lot of assets in Afghanistan. It really did not. The CIA did, right? The CIA had advisors had intelligence assets in Afghanistan, and also had this technology known as drones, right? The CIA had been pioneering that. So when the United States wanted to make war in Afghanistan, it could rely on those assets, its drone assets, its IC assets that were in Afghanistan. It could also rely on special forces that were part of CENTCOM, because that would allow it to insert itself into Afghanistan. Again, that's using the assets you have. Now, think about the recent coronavirus outbreak. How can the US respond? Well, this was not something that was necessarily predicted 5 years ago, right? There was ideas about pandemics that were in the United States, but in a sense, how could the United States respond today to the outbreak of a pandemic? It has to use the assets it has, right? It has to use the bureaucracies that it actually has. So it can call upon the CDC and other agencies that are already available. It doesn't necessarily create new agencies out of thin air. The executive has to use the assets and the bureaucracies that are already there to respond to crises. So, question is, how do bureaucracies do in crisis? Now, something that I do want to emphasize to all of you is that responding to crisis is actually a very difficult job. And I want to just stop and have you think about that. It is a difficult job, right? To actually respond to crisis, right? As easy as it is to do to criticize the behavior of bureaucracies and their outputs after the fact, you have to remember that when crises are happening, bureaucrats are just trying to respond as best as they can, right? And they're doing this in a really noisy environment. They're doing this under incredible time pressure. And they're doing this in an area where information is difficult to interpret. Information is not necessarily forthcoming, right? So how do you know necessarily any of this stuff, right? And the stakes are really high, right? In many of these crisis situations, there's intense time pressure. There's need for coordination. So think about after 9/11. There are several different bureaucracies that would have to spring into action here, right? There's the police agencies that would have to spring into action. There's the emergency officers that would have to spring into action. FEMA would have to spring into action. How do you coordinate all of that? And how do you do it quickly, right? Each of these agencies probably thinks their mission is paramount, but you have to somehow find a way to coordinate. And new events are coming in just as you speak. As you deploy emergency assets to New York, what you start to hear is that there might be other threats coming from aircraft. So the FAA has to get involved too, right? So these bureaucracies have to deal with information that's coming at them very fast. The stakes are really high. There's time pressure and there's need for coordination. Now, I've told you before, the US government is not a thing, right? It's a collection of these bureaucracies that are staffed by people. What are governments? They are people. People have to coordinate in these very difficult times. People have to coordinate in this incredible time pressure. And not to mention, they're scared themselves. They're involved in this decision making too, right? The consequences affect them too. They have families as well. So this is a difficult thing to actually work with. Like in situations like 9/11 or in any other crisis situation, it's hard for bureaucracies to actually respond. So one thing that was done is to try to understand how do bureaucracies actually function in times of crises. This was done, a study by Graham Allison that you're supposed to read for today tried to get at this. What Allison did was he basically examined the Cuban Missile Crisis under 3 different scenarios. One, he imagined the United States that was just the United States as a unitary actor. I've talked to you several times that this is, in a lot of ways, an absurd assumption that the United States coordinates perfectly together, right? But this was the first assumption, and this is assumption from this line of thinking called realism, which assumes that the state is a unitary actor. If you assume that the state is a unitary actor, the typical assumption is that states are seeking to maximize their power and are going to choose goals that are consistent, are going to choose strategies that are consistent with that goal. And they're going to make decisions based on cost-benefit analyses. So according to this rational actor framework, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US made decisions that were intended to maximize its power, minimize its costs, and maximize its benefits. So let's think about the situation that bureaucracies faced. On October 16, 1962, the US discovered missile sites in Cuba. Now, this is interesting because these nuclear missile sites were less than 90 miles from the coast of the United States, which is less than the distance from here to Charlotte. Right? So again, bear that in mind, right? This was very close to US territory. The presence of these offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba would disrupt US strategy. US strategy in competing with the Soviet Union depended on the United States initiating the first strike if there were a nuclear war. The US did not have the large military presence that the Soviet Union had in Europe, so the only way they could deter the Soviet Union was to guarantee that if a war broke out, the United States was going to strike and strike first and was going to hit with nuclear weapons. But if the Soviets put nuclear weapons in Cuba, suddenly they could strike the United States first, which would disrupt the ability of the United States to deter the Soviet Union in Europe. That was the problem. This was a significantly destabilizing event in that way, right? This would offset the US first strike advantage. If the missiles became operational, they could reach the United States very quickly and destroy US sites before a counterattack could occur. So think about what this meant. The bureaucracies were designed to think we have first strike advantage over the Soviet Union. Now it looks like they may not have that, and they have to respond to this new set of conditions. And they have to figure out, is there a way to try to reverse that trend, to try to push it back to the way it was, because that's what the Kennedy administration was demanding. They have to be creative. They have to come up with something that's out of their norm, right? This isn't a standard norm operational procedure. They have to figure out and think about what assets does the United States have to push this situation back to the way it was or to counter this new world that we're in. So if we look at this from a realist perspective, the government had several different options. It could do nothing. It could choose to invade. It could choose to blockade, right? The way Allison envisioned this is that the state would think rationally, what is the best course of action for us that maximizes the benefit while minimizing the cost. According to that model, the blockade was best because it's better than doing nothing, but also minimizes the chance of war, and so therefore the US adopted the blockade. This is a very strange reading of history, right? I say that as a political scientist. That's somewhat sympathetic to Graham Allison, given that he's also a political scientist. But this is, to put on my PWAD hat, where I'm leading an interdisciplinary curriculum, this is a very, very strange reading of history to the point where it's bizarre, right? And because if we actually look at the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was not a whole lot of support for blockade. The overwhelming narrative was that the U.S. needed to invade, right? The blockade was adopted really as, in a sense, as part of an accident because the person that wanted the blockade was Kennedy himself and a speechwriter. So Kennedy, in a sense, pushed through the agenda of trying to get the blockade because that's what he wanted, but it had nothing to do with maximizing power. In fact, quite the opposite. It had to do with trying to avoid war, right? If the U.S. really wanted to maximize its power, it would invade, right? It could do that, right? So I think the realist explanation is a strange reading of history. So we go to Allison's second world, and I should say Allison was doing this on purpose. The realist explanation, the unitary actor explanation, is in a lot of ways set up as a straw man. Right? If we look at Allison's next model, it's the organizational processes model. Here, we change our conception of the state. It's not a unitary actor. In fact, what it is a collection of bureaucracies, which we know that it is. And the bureaucracies have lots of inefficiencies about them, meaning that they have functions and they try to fit whatever they get. Since if they have square pegs, they try to fit it into round holes all the time, right? So if you're the Navy, you want to blockade things because that's what you do. It doesn't matter if that's appropriate or not. If you are the Army, you want to invade things because that's what you do, right? Or you're the Marine Corps, you want to invade things, that's what you do, right? And so in a sense, what you see are bureaucracies having one purpose, right? That's what they're designed to do. And they try to fit those purposes into whatever the challenge is ahead of them. So even though they are this flawed conglomerate, the state's ability to respond to different challenges is limited by what these bureaucracies do. Based on this argument, the only option the US had that was effective was to blockade. Again, I think this is a strange reading of history, right? But I think the basic insight here is true, that the ability of the state to respond to any crisis is going to be a function of what its bureaucracies actually can do, right? And how its bureaucracies are designed. So the third process that Allison talks about is this idea of bureaucratic processes, where what the decision that is ultimately made by the executive is a product of competition between the heads of these bureaucracies. And the bureaucracies compete with each other to try to get their organization to do things. And it's the idea of where you stand is where you sit. So according to this, in the bureaucratic process model, the Navy advocated for blockade, the Army advocated for invasion, the Air Force advocated for bombing because that's what they do. And then the executive makes a decision based on these options. I don't think it's wrong to say that bureaucracies advocate for using their assets. They do that. I think it is wrong to say that they solely do that, right? Heads of bureaucracies facing new crises, facing new challenges, often do have to be creative. Now, they want their organization to be involved in solutions, but I think it's fair to say that many of them are willing to work and play, right? Some of them prefer their organization to others, and there certainly is bureaucratic rivalry and things like that does exist. But when it comes time to respond to a solution, there is an emphasis, I think, on trying to use the different assets and to use them in some synchrony where they can actually work together, so they don't do any more harm than good. Right, so the bureaucratic politics explanation of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the different branches want to do what they did best. Their preferences were a function of what the organizations did. They compete for Kennedy's favor, and Kennedy elected to impose the blockade, which is a function of what the bureaucracies, of this competition of the bureaucracies. So I think you can see how this is inefficient. Right. That again, if we think about the bureaucratic politics model, the Army is saying we have to invade, the Air Force saying we have to bomb, the Navy saying we have to engage in some sort of blockade. What you ideally would want in responding to something like Cuba is for all of these assets to integrate. Right. You would want the invasion to be supported by air power that synchronizes with the invasion force and not operates separately. And you'd want the Navy to be able to harmoniously work with the Army. Right, you would want these assets to all work together, not compete with each other. But that's what they did oftentimes, right? Pre-Goldwater Nichols, these organizations often competed with each other and didn't coordinate with each other all that well. So what Goldwater Nichols intended to do was to mitigate inter-service rivalry. So it introduced coordination in something called the Airland Battle Doctrine, which meant that there had to be coordination between these different branches of the military. The way the new command structure would work is that the president would direct the Secretary of Defense, who would then directly direct the commander of the combatant command, who then executes the orders. Notice again, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is here as an advisory position, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs isn't part of the combatant command, right? The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is not part of the decision to initiate war. If there's going to be a decision to initiate war or any sort of military action, the president would direct the Secretary of Defense, who would then directly talk to either NORCOM, SOCOM, AFRICOM, CENTCOM, INDOPACOM, or the EUCOM. That combatant commander would then initiate the orders. Right, and this allowed for greater coordination because underneath these commands, PACOM, for example, has Marine assets and Navy assets under it and Army assets that all work together to try to initiate U.S. policy and support U.S. policy in the Pacific theater. Same thing with CENTCOM. CENTCOM has different branches operating underneath it that work together to try to accomplish missions in the Middle East. So this allows for more coordination and more implementation of the Airland Battle Doctrine, which allows the branches to work better. The evidence that this was more successful came in the form of the first Gulf War. Right, the performance of the U.S. military in the first Gulf War was looked at as very, very good, especially in comparison to Grenada, right, where the U.S. military in the first Gulf War used all of its assets, used its air assets, its Army assets, its Navy assets together in this really synchronous way to accomplish its objectives, which it did in the first Gulf War quite successfully. Okay, so that's the outline of what the U.S. actually has, right? So again, the way you can look at this is that if you look at NORCOM, SOCOM, AFRICOM, CENTCOM, INDOPACOM, and EUCOM, those are the main assets that a president has in a time of crisis to respond to this crisis. Pre-crisis, it has this large State Department, it has this large intelligence bureaucracy. Think of those as assets, right? If a president is going to make a decision, if a president is going to implement the policy, the bureaucrats are the assets it has to actually make those policies work. Same thing with Congress. What we want to do in this next segment, I'm going to stop this segment for now. What we want to do in this next segment is to talk about how well does the president use these assets in times of crisis and what's motivating presidents in times of crisis, right? And how do they respond in these times of crisis given their rational motivations? So we will stop this part for now and we'll start the next segment momentarily.